So today I wanted to talk about the wealth tax. Now, before we talk about why I think Labour dropped the wealth tax, and to be honest, they're trying to avoid what happened in 1992, but again, we'll get to that later. But as you know, I am for a wealth tax. I think when you have seen the numbers, just like a 0.3% wealth tax gains billions upon billions of pounds just for a country, and yet a 1% wealth tax, even a one-off 1% wealth tax, would generate billions in tax revenue. But we have to look at, as we said, what happened in 1992. Because once again, in 1992, Labour government expected to storm to victory and take power from a Conservative government that delivered a very, very bad economic situation for the UK, and had continued to do just awful and lurch from one disaster to the next. Very similar times. However, there was at the time the Chancellor, or at least the Labour shadow Chancellor, proposed that there would be a new wealth tax brand. And the Conservatives seized on this as the opportunity to go hard on Labour. And that was seen by a lot of experts at the time of that's why they lost that election. That the Conservatives managed to make enough hay out of it and convince people, oh, you're going to get taxed to high heaven and back. It managed to convince enough people, at least at that time, to give the Conservatives another chance, of course, before 1997 would step in. But avoiding like that, and avoiding that misstep, and Rachel Reeves not saying that she's not going to do a wealth tax, but there are other ways she can get that money. Because you've got chronically underfunded, years of neglect of public services that need funding. You've got crumbling schools. You've got the NHS crisis. All these things will have to be found out. What on earth have the Conservatives been doing with all that tax revenue? Where has it been going? And how can we start to solve the situation out? Now, a lot of people will say, oh, but we're already taxed incredibly high. Yes, but where does most of that money actually go? It's a fair amount of questions, to be honest. And I think when we see Labour take over, we're going to see, shall we say, a rebalancing probably of those books to see where all that stuff will go. But it's not the end of the world, because Labour could tax rich people in a vastly different way. One of the things, if you follow Professor Richard Murphy, by the way, one of those experts who doesn't tend to get a lot of airtime on TV, but his blog, I feel, is known well enough that people would probably know who they are. If you don't know who he is, tax expert. I would love to speak to him one of these days, because he's honestly really, really good and he knows what he's talking about. And tax is one of those things where you need an expert really to talk to people about it. But one of the things that he brings up, that if Labour did bring in a wealth tax, look, these wealthy people already spend vast amounts of money on trying to avoid paying taxes in the first place. So they are only going to go even harder on trying to avoid paying that wealth tax, using whatever they possibly can not to pay it. So that is one reason why probably avoiding that for at least the time being is a good idea. But if what Reeves is saying, that she wants to, speed up the economic growth rate, do all these stuff for higher public spending, you can't do that without higher taxes. And I think sooner or later, reality is going to have to really kick in. And even the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said this. They've said that without tax rises, UK public services and benefit provisions will simply tread water. It will deteriorate. And unless tax levels increase substantially, A reduction in the scope of the public services that the British states provides is likely inevitable. So that is a very, very clear assessment, because what we have seen is a reduction and a cutting to the bone by the Conservatives over the past 13 years of public services. And what they desperately need is refunding. Now, we don't know what the Conservatives have been up to behind the scenes. They've cut all this money back. And of course, Conservatives love to tell you, oh, well, we're such a rich nation, but for some reason we can't do this. Well, we've got other countries who have higher tax brackets, take much more in tax, but they give so much back in terms of public services. And I think the era of us expecting low taxes is over. It's over. But for the vast majority of us, we're not really going to see that too much of a higher increase. I think it's probably going to be the upper echelon that is going to do this. So where is it? Hang on. So one of the interesting figures, of course, that comes out of this before we get to what Richard Murphy had to say on this is about where all our wealth actually is in this country, because you've got 10% of the richest households own half of the UK's wealth, and just a bottom 50%, just 9%. So you can see how bad the tax system is. So there definitely needs to be a rethinking of how we do this, a change in how we look at our tax system, how it encourages this. And of course, most of this, this was wealth is in bricks and mortar rather than, well, innovation. And that is a problem, especially if you want to get your economy going. Bricks and mortar is fine so long as there's building going on, but there comes a point where to build too much, well, you don't want to build too much, because, of course, if you start to build more, well, then those other things that you built sort of decrease in value because there's a etc. etc. Oh, bless me. But a lot of people are expecting there to be a property bubble burst. And of course, for a country like ours that has all its, all this wealth tied up in bricks and mortar, rather than, things like innovation or to business, it doesn't really spell good for that. But she can, though, do something else, because this is what Professor Richard Murphy said. So he said that Labour is right to rule out a bespoke levy, something that he says would actually be difficult to collect owing to the ability, as we said, of the super rich to employ the best financial advisors and lawyers. But it can more easily tax the wealth through the current system. Take one example. The better off get high rates of tax relief on their pension contributions than those earning less, and restricting the pension's tax relief to about 20% would raise up to £14.5 billion a year, according to Murphy's own calculations. So there are other options. Reeves does have a lot more options. So just because there is no wealth tax now does not mean that Rachel Reeves cannot tax the wealthy in different ways, or reforming the tax system. That itself would be, I think, a gargantuan task itself. Like I say, if you read Richard Murphy's blog, he even said just what a gargantuan task that would be. I mean, we'd have to go back to the beginning, rip up the current rule book, and just start again. Our tax code actually hasn't been reformed since like 18 something, and we've just been writing on top of it continuously. And this is what has created massive loopholes, which, of course, the rich and wealthy employ all the best lawyers and accountants to find those loopholes, so that they can, just continue to accrue massive amounts of wealth without it being taxed. So obviously there are lots of different problems, but just because there is no wealth tax now doesn't mean there will be one later. And of course, it does not mean that Rachel Reeves will have other ways to bring in tax. And the fact that, of course, at the moment, that is a possibility, but she also hasn't said what those other ways potentially are at the moment, does give her a lot of wiggle room. But we'll see what happens when it comes to a general election. Remember, in 1992, this was the thing that Labour had pinned their hopes on, especially back then. And they were already talking about it before 1992. And the Conservatives used this, especially before and in the general election, to make hay, which allowed them to survive. And many people would definitely agree in 1992, they did not really deserve another term. Yet we've got the exact same situation where we have an absolute catastrophe of a Conservative government that really doesn't deserve a second term, not less even, being close to power ever again. But being wary and being cautious at the moment is paying off. And this is where I hope that at the general election, this is where we start to see these bold proposals. This is where we start to see this in the manifesto. So don't be upset that there's no wealth tax now, because there are other ways that Rachel Reeves can go and tax the rich. So don't be too upset about that. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.